Nothing gets you more comfortable than being on stage in front of everybody nude.
Wow.
I really enjoyed escaping into the world of another character where I could express myself. Communication is more about connecting than being perfect. My teachers always taught me you have to find the love. There has to be love to have conflict. Because if you didn't love, you wouldn't care so much. How are those situations influencing us physically, influencing our body, and then influencing...
Hey, everybody. Welcome. This is Preston Poore, P-Cube. Thanks for joining us today. I'm very excited to have our guest, Morgan Rysdon, joining us today. She was a vocal coach of mine. I will talk a little bit about how we met in just a minute and some things maybe I learned in that, right? So it's good stuff, and I appreciate you. But I like to start with a quick story in P-Cube. And it's about, this episode's going to be about finding your voice. And that means many different ways, from a confidence perspective, the way you articulate, the way that you express yourself. So I thought we'd cover a lot of different areas on that, not only the physical portion of it, but also then somebody's seeking their voice. I want to talk a little bit about my journey. I want to hear about your journey too as we go through that. But you know what? I always love to think about my puppy, Bonnie. We had Bonnie for 17 years. And Bonnie, when she was a puppy, we'd put her down and we'd walk around with her for a little bit. And I think one day we were in my son's bedroom and she hadn't barked yet. And all of a sudden she had this look on her face and she looking up like this. And all of a sudden she went, "Arr!" like that. And she was a beagle. And from that point on, she had that voice that she discovered it in the room. And so she kept using it and using it. It was great. So all through, and you've probably heard a beagle bark before, right? They've got that very unique voice that you can pick up and identify. And I think that's one thing I think that's neat is that if we as individuals and leaders can figure out our voice, not only what we can share with, because we do have a voice, what we say has meaning. It can have meaning for other people. It can help other people. And also the way we use our voice is what I think is going to be so important to talk about today, right? And I have some examples, and I'd love maybe some coaching online too as we go through that. So does that make sense? Is that good?
Yeah, sounds
so
great.
Good. So I'm excited to have Morgan here with me today. I real quick set up this whole thing for the audience is that so I retire, and I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do, and I'm getting into this speaking business, and I say, okay, I need to learn how to act. Maybe I heard a guy named Brian Tracy, who is a famous speaker. He takes acting classes, and I think some of them do. So I thought I'd go in there and try that, and I chickened out after a couple things. And then I said, okay, well, how about my voice? How do I do that? And so I signed up for your class at the Alliance Theater, and we hadn't met before. And I got in there, and I was just so impressed about the way you coached everybody individually and spent time with them about how they brought material in, they read something out loud, and the way it was positive. It was all positive, and you gave some really good feedback, too, about how to improve. And it greatly helped me. It doesn't sound like it today because today's a high allergy day in Atlanta, so I sound like a WSB radio host or something today, but that's the way it goes.
Sounds good.
So I want to welcome Morgan to the show. And Morgan, I just love to really just start out and say thank you for being here. But why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? Tell us about your origin story. Where'd you come from?
Yeah, so I originally came from the world of theater, so hence we met at the Alliance Theater, but I'm an Alexander Technique teacher now, but my background is in performance art. I have a BA in acting, and I think like a lot of individuals who have experienced any kind of trauma, I really enjoyed escaping into the world of another character where I could express myself in the comfort of someone else's imaginary circumstances and lines and setting. And, through my acting, I was exposed to Alexander Technique. And it was by my movement instructor. He was stage combat movement, and he was also an Alexander Technique teacher. And to be quite honest, I had no idea what we were doing. I had taken a voice class at my university as well. And this movement class also started to introduce me to this idea that, the mind and the body and the voice are not totally disconnected, which I had never really even thought about. Yeah. And I think at the beginning, I didn't even really understand Alexander Technique. I just knew what I felt and the benefits that I got, which was that my body felt amazing and that I felt really good. And I didn't understand it. I didn't really know exactly what was happening. I just knew I needed to dive in more. So once I had completed my 4 years of university, I went to move to Chicago, and that's where I started performing and auditioning. And fast forward, my husband decided to get his master's at Yale, so we moved out to the East Coast. And then I said, oh, there's the oldest training program in the Alexander Technique. It's a 3-year program. It's over 1,600 hours. And so I said, I'm going to dive in and I'm going to learn to teach this work. Well, fast forward, and I ended up loving this work that I do and not really looking back. I found that this work was really about self-work. So whereas theater allowed me to escape and take on other individuals' characteristics and voice, Alexander Technique really helped me find my own voice, the way that I want to be with ease and comfort and confidence. So now those are sort of the skills and the tools. And while I work with a lot of actors, I also work with lawyers, doctors, general individuals who just want to feel better in their bodies. And so then that's how I met you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it all came together right there. So thank you. So what is Alexander method, right? Tell me, tell the audience a little bit about what that is and then how it helps someone.
So the Alexander Technique is a mind-body technique. It's a form of re-education, if you want to think of it that way, where you learn the habits that you have and how they may be interfering with your everyday use of your body, your voice, or your breath. So the individual who created it, F.M. Alexander, from a long time ago, he's no longer here, he actually was an actor himself. So he's from Tasmania, he was a performer, and he ended up losing his voice quite frequently. And as a result, he would go to the doctors and say, what am I doing that's causing me to have these problems? And they'd say, well, we don't know, but go on vocal rest. So he would take a break from performance. He would go off and rest his voice and not speak, and his voice would come back. But then he would go back to performing and he'd lose his voice again. So there was sort of a cycle that he experienced, and he said, I must be doing something. I need to figure it out. And so he surrounded himself with 3-way mirrors. He looked at the way that he was using his body, his head, his neck, and he realized he was actually compromising his vocal cords. And he re-educated himself about how am I going to use myself in a way that is not going to interfere with my voice. And he actually was known as the breath doctor. So by the time he moved to London and took his work there, a lot of people came to him with problems for their voice and their breathing, as well as physical ailments as well. So now a lot of the people that I see do come because they want to have better posture or they want to get rid of pain that is reoccurring, whether it's chronic or acute. And then also people like yourself, people who want to improve their performance and they want to have more ease and comfort so that they can use their bodies in a way that's more efficient.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go to it real quick. So coach me real quick here, if you will. So I've been sitting in the studio. I think we've done 30 episodes, right? Something like that. And been having a lot of fun, but I find myself as the host sitting in the chair over here, and I look at myself on the video. It seems like sometimes I never take a breath.
Yeah.
Like I don't slow down. And also, I feel like I'm flush all the time, red. It's probably the adrenaline and all that.
Yeah.
But how could you help me, just for the folks listening or that be curious, what would you do right now to tell me and say, hey, Press, maybe if you did this, so let's try this together? Because be honest with you, on the way here, I did some of the exercises. I always do.
Yes.
Did my, my mouth exercises. I was doing that. I forget when you go, then I was doing
raspberries.
That, spit going
yes,
everywhere, right?
Perfect.
So in some of the breathing, I've actually used that where you're not pushing the air out, but you're using the back of it. And those things have been very helpful for me.
Great.
But sitting here in the studio, what would you tell me right now? I'm very self-conscious, by the way, with you in here, so that's okay. I'd love the coaching.
Yes. Okay. So the first thing I always look at is, are you comfortable physically in your body? So I changed out my chairs. Before we began, there was this sort of ergonomic chair with rollers. Yeah. My chair is now a folding chair with no rollers. It's flat. It's stable. And yours has arms, mine does not.
Yeah, right.
So I always ask students, are you comfortable? Do you feel comfortable? If not, you have a blazer on. Mm-hmm. Would you be more comfortable without a blazer? Mm-hmm. Today, I decided I didn't want anything around my throat. Mm-hmm. So I'm thoughtful about what am I putting on as far as clothing, what am I wearing? And then even once you get to a space like you are today, are you comfortable with where you're at? Because you have the ability to adjust, also making sure that not just your neck and head is turned to one side, but that your whole body is aligned.
Right.
So, and then also giving yourself permission to change, right?
Yeah, right.
To, if in the moment you feel uncomfortable, pausing long enough to change something about it. If it's a drink of water because you feel like your mouth is getting dry, or in your case, you talked about adrenaline. I think actually adrenaline is really important. So I think, for example, I would argue that Taylor Swift probably still has adrenaline before getting on stage, right? Certain football players will have adrenaline.
Sure.
And that's because you want to be able to perform at that higher level. And so I think sometimes we mistake adrenaline with this idea of nervousness where it's just excitement and we're excited to be performing, right? And so I think also reassuring ourselves that any sort of adrenaline we have doesn't necessarily mean that we have to not breathe, right? That you can still exhale and allow yourself to be present with where you're at.
Yeah, so good. That's good. It's funny, this public speaking training and the coaching that I've had over the years, somebody once said to me that those people that normally are as cool as a cucumber are about as boring as a cucumber. Right?
Oh.
So it's because, right, they get up there and they're cool, but they just are a little flat. So I understand the other piece. And I remember a guy named John was my coach at Dale Carnegie Training. He said, everybody has butterflies in their stomach before they perform. You just have to realize that. It's part of it. The question is, how do you get those butterflies to fly in formation, right?
Yeah.
Instead of fluttering around, right? So to your point, I think you're harnessing the adrenaline, if you will, and not being worried about it, not making you anxious, but use it in your performance or you're being on stage.
Yeah, I think it's presence, right? Being able to be present when you're speaking.
Yeah, that makes a big difference. And then one other thing I want to ask you about. So I remember one of the things I struggle with, and maybe people on the on air or listening today, is this. I shared a story. It was probably kind of vulnerable, a little bit more vulnerable in your class, right? Because you asked us, why are you here? And I shared with the class and said, okay, well, when I worked at Hershey Foods, I worked for a tough manager. And then as things went along, he always criticized me in front of other people. And so I got this reservation and this check in the back of my mind about the criticism was coming. And then the inner critic behind that was, hey, Press, don't say something. You might get fired. They may laugh at you. It may not be right. Those kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
And so I find myself, even at 58 years old, still struggling sometimes when I'm trying to spit things out. It's not because I can't. It's because of that filter that I've got going back and the voice that doesn't come out all the way.
Yeah.
Do you ever run into that kind of challenge for people? Do you ever see that? Or is it the first case that you ever
seen? No, I think that's really common. And I probably talked a little bit about this book by Kristen Linklater. She has this book called Freeing the Natural Voice, which I often recommend to actors and singers. And in chapter 2 on why the voice does not work, I'm very specific, but there's a beautiful paragraph, and I'm going to paraphrase.
Okay.
But she talks about how a lot of habits are very important. They're essential. They're necessary, whether it's you deciding what to wear or to take a shower at night or in the morning or what route to take to work. We have habits about the way that we work through our day. However, she goes on to talk about most mental and emotional habits that we have are oftentimes conditioned into us unconsciously and by other people than oneself. And then she adds often in childhood. So while yours was in adulthood, I think that sometimes the way that people are interacting with us does start to influence how we feel and how we think about ourselves and then how we show up ultimately, because we are now in a state of what I would call reactive versus responsive, right? Reactive meaning it's habitual, it's without consciousness, without thought, versus I'm going to choose a response, okay? So to give you an example, which it's vulnerable for me as well, when I was going to train to become an Alexander teacher, I had this very harsh boss. I was working as a bartender, and she was this woman, Missy from New Jersey. So she had this thick New Jersey accent, and we were having a staff meeting in front of a whole bunch of people. And she said to me as I was reaching up and I was standing on this stool or chair to get some creamers and set stuff up and what have you, Morgan, in this very thick New Jersey accent, why is your butt getting so big? And I remember freezing. My rear end is facing everybody. And for listeners, I'm not a very large woman. I'm actually quite petite. But whatever. She was criticizing my rear end. And I remember in that moment initially just feeling startled, tight in my muscles. My breath stopped, and I didn't know what to do. So we would call that fight, flight, or freeze.
That's right, yeah.
And I decided to let my breath out, exhale. I relaxed, I turned around, and I chose a response, which was, I don't know, Missy. I guess my butt is just getting bigger. What do you say to that?
Yeah.
And you could tell she was not really happy with that. It's sort of, wah, wah, it wasn't the response she was anticipating.
Yeah. Okay.
And I was very excited to tell my teacher about how I used Alexander technique in this heightened, stressful moment. And she said, that's really good. I'm very proud of you, but sometimes you're not going to want to have to work that hard. And so I quit. It was this idea that sometimes we don't want to have to use the skills that we learn in Alexander technique, and we don't want to have to learn how to relax in those moments on a daily basis, right? Because it can begin to influence how we're showing up. And so I don't want to have to be constantly in these moments where I'm in fight or flight, just at my job, setting up, getting ready for a staff meeting, right? So I think when we're in a relationship or in situations where we have a habitual reaction to something, it's helpful if we can step aside and observe it and ask ourselves, what's happening in this moment? Is it that serious? What am I doing? What is the other person doing? Am I choosing responses, or am I just being reactive? And maybe is there something I could do differently, right, in order to change that situation?
Right. Or you could have turned around with a smart ass comment, right? And got
yes,
back
that's
out
true
of it.
too.
It, right?
That's true too. That's true too. If I'd been quick-witted enough.
But thank you for that story. That's So I think it's to your point. Once it becomes unconscious, right?
Yes.
That reaction, the response that you're talking about. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to work that hard. Is that the coach's point, right, in that?
It's the point is that we will in life have to experience stress and discomfort.
Yes. Yeah.
That is inevitable. If we are alive, we are going to have moments that we're uncomfortable. But what do we do about it?
Yeah.
How are those situations influencing us physically, influencing our body, and then influencing our breath and our voice?
Yeah.
And can we then choose to do something differently? And if we are repeatedly putting ourselves in those situations that we're constantly triggered and having to work at it, it might not be worth it. Yeah. So, being prepared, right, is helpful, because then we have skills that we can use. But do we want to have to use those day in, day out? Is it very sustainable? Not really.
It's almost impossible,
Yeah.
right, to be there on that whole thing. Okay, that's good. It makes me think about the workplace then. We use this phrase, it's fight, flight, or freeze.
Yeah.
And it makes me think about, they talk about corporate engagement. I don't know if you've ever heard the term engagement before, but it's the level of discretionary effort somebody's willing to put forth based on the relationship with their manager or their workplace. So you imagine the bartending job that you had and the manager that you had, you were probably not as engaged with that individual, the work you were doing, because of the way that she treated you, or the work environment you were in. But you had that fight or flight or freeze, right? And so I often think about, how do you build a safe environment where people don't have that? Everybody's going to encounter stress, right? We have deadlines and all that. But if you're a true leader that builds a culture where your team's not faced with their performance all the time, and you want the best out of that individual, make a big difference, don't you think?
Yeah, I think that also goes to speaking to the idea of how are we communicating, right? How am I saying it versus not the what that I'm saying, right? And we've talked about that in the class, where I talked about that 7% rule, that only 7% of our content is actually what I'm saying. There's 38% that is left to my voice, my inflection, my tone, my cadence, my pace. And then you've got 55%, which is the body language, right? Which your listeners cannot hear, but they can probably tell that, okay, most likely these individuals are using facial expressions. Most likely they're using hand gestures, right? And sometimes when people are speaking more monotone or disengaged, they tend to have maybe a lack of facial movement, maybe a lack of good posture. Maybe they are not looking at who they're talking to, right? So all of those things kind of come together. And I think when we understand the importance of all of these components of communication, we can be better presenters, and we can engage better with our leaders or our employees. Yeah,
so true. It's funny. I've written a book called How is Greater Than What, but I never thought about it from the lens of what you just said in terms of communication. I've used that statistic a million times, so thank you for that, because how you communicate, your tone and your visual, I call them verbal, vocal, and visual. So the verbal are the words, The vocal's the tone.
Yep.
The visual is the kind of what you see or what you observe,
Yes.
right? And so the how you communicate is often greater than what you're actually communicating.
Of course.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
On that. So good. Let's shift a little bit on this because I love talking about the Alexander technique, but I want to go against this idea right now about how does somebody find their voice, not actually using it right now, but finding their voice, the confidence to do that. Just to tell you my quick journey on it is that a long time ago, I went and got some training from John Maxwell. You heard John Maxwell before?
Yes.
Famous author, right? And a leadership guru. And I went to some training, got certified and all that stuff. And so I had the access to all of his content. And so I found that I could use his content and then go teach people with that content. And then I started thinking, well, okay, it's neat that it's his stuff, but how do I infuse my stories into the content to connect with people in the audience? I don't want to tell about John Maxwell's stories all the time, just feel like his ambassador. But they encouraged me in that to have at least 20 stories that I could use for each of the workshops I did. So it was a personal story that I could use. And then after I progressed past that, I started thinking about, okay, well, I've got some principles that I've learned in my life. How do I capture those and then put my stories behind them? And it's interesting, I started doing that, and I've written a few books now, and it's not John Maxwell's books, they're Preston Poore's books, right? But the neat thing is that as I discovered my voice, because I had to go through that progression, I had to kind of have a role model, something to think about, something to bounce things off of, formulate my own thoughts.
Yeah.
And then write those down and then write the books. But it's kind of neat, Morgan, when and I'm sure you see this in coaching too, when you see somebody doing or saying or referring to something that you've helped them with or that they've read, that's your voice coming through. And then they find their voice through that as well. And they may go through the same progression. So that's kind of my journey about how I found my voice from actually being somebody else, using somebody else's content, to moving into thinking, hey, what do I think about this? And then using my voice to help impact others. How from your perspective, would somebody go about finding their voice? And this is really about confidence too, right?
Yeah, I think it's very normal for people to observe and mimic and, imitate other people in order to learn. I think that's how a lot of us grow up and we decide who good speakers or presenters are and what that looks like. And I think when we're trying to be these other individuals, there's a little bit of effort and there's some tightness and tension in that. And then the challenge becomes, how do we avoid falling into habits of trying to be somebody else? And when I talk to my students about finding their natural voice, I talk to them about being authentic and about being present, which means knowing where you are in time and space and knowing what's behind you, what's in front of you. And then knowing, for example, how many times have you just finished a sentence, even though you don't have any more air inside you, but you're just really trying to get that point across because, and now, versus knowing, okay, I need to take a moment and I need to be able to breathe. And I think that we need to practice those things that we want to get good at. Sometimes I believe that students just come in and they say, okay, I would like to have this. It's the goal, right? And whatever that goal is. And they kind of expect it to arrive instantaneously. And I'm like, yeah, that's not how things work. You know what I mean? And what I love is I always talk to students about when children are developing, you never see kids learning to walk and they're at daycare and they're like falling and they're like, oh man, little Johnny over there's already got it. And I haven't, and I'm not going to get up. No, they just keep getting up. Right. They're just really committed to getting better at the thing, whatever that thing is. Sure. And I think that for an individual to find their natural voice, I think the commitment to curiosity about how can I be more present? How can I notice when I've got tension in my throat or in my shoulders or in my back? When am I feeling uncomfortable and what can I do instead? And that's why a lot of the stuff I teach is the how to do that. Okay, so I want to be present, but how, Morgan? And that's where I come in with the tools and the skills of how to do that. But I think you have to recognize habits of yours and then consciously be intentional about what you're trying to change. If you're somebody who runs out of breath when you're speaking, okay, we can work with that. Let's practice pausing, practice exhaling, letting your air out. If you feel like you've gotten reports that you're a bit dry or monotone, vary your pitch, your intonation, color your words a little bit more and be more intentional about how you're storytelling. Right.
That's so good. It's funny. I remember this gentleman that I worked for at the Dale Carnegie Organization in Birmingham, Alabama, early '90s, and I was so enamored by him. And he was a fantastic public speaker. And I guess I was the diamond of the rough kind of thing. So there was a lot of chiseling that had to happen on me before they got to it, and still a lot of chiseling going on. But I found myself mimicking John. I would tilt my head the same way he did, or he had this nervous twitch that he would do with his wrist as speaking. And I found myself doing that after that.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and I don't. And then when I finally caught myself doing that kind of stuff, I said, "That's just stupid. Why would I do that?" But it's because I had watched him as an example. I wanted to be good at what I did. And so maybe in some subconscious habits that I picked up on that. But eventually, that's part of my finding my own voice is I said, well, that's John. That's not That's not Preston. That's not me. And not sure what my motions are. If somebody looked at me and said, okay, I'm going to mimic Preston, I'm not sure what those would be. But I found that just a very interesting part of my journey, if you will, trying to figure all that out. So really good. All right, let's talk a little bit about fear. Fear. The acronym for fear that I've learned is false evidence appearing real. Have you heard that before?
No, but I love it already. Can you repeat it?
Because false evidence appearing real. Right? So the acronym behind that. So, but as you were acting, right, and then you encounter other people that might have fear, that might be holding them back from their voice as well, right?
Yes.
Tell me about how you, how you overcome fear when you're maybe even on stage or in front of somebody. And then two, how you would coach somebody else in that. And do you have a specific example where you remember you were just scared out of your wits, Morgan, when you're performing? You probably didn't. You're such a professional, but
well, you don't actually probably want to know how I got over all of my fears, but I will share it with you.
Okay. I do.
Because I realized I was in a play in college and I had a fear. My character was changing on stage, so I had to go from like one top to another and just have a bra on, which is basically a bikini top. But that made me uncomfortable. Mm. So I did a show completely in the nude that summer. Yes, and my parents came along with my grandmother.
That'll make a great
true
clip.
story.
We're going to get everybody's attention on Andy's over there. It's
yes.
going to make a great 30-second clip.
Nothing gets you more comfortable than being on stage in front of everybody nude.
Wow. Okay.
And it was performance art. We had lights projected on our body. It was collaborative. Everybody in the show was nude. So all of us, different body types, shapes, sizes. And you really, once you've done that, it's very empowering because you're like, I feel like I can do anything. Right? I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for people. You don't necessarily need to go to such an extreme. Mm-hmm. But for me, it was helpful to allow myself not to feel shame or discomfort.
Okay.
And also to shift my focus from me to others. So I think sometimes, and I think fear and rejection, we're speaking about it maybe relative to presenters or speakers, like leaders in the world. But I think everybody relates to this, being, having thoughts of rejection or fearing things. And I think what happens is our mental chatter gets in the way of us being able to connect with individuals. And so while I do teach self-awareness, I'm not teaching self-consciousness because I think self-consciousness relates to being critical of oneself. Like, oh man, I just said that. Why did I? And I wish I didn't do. And then all of a sudden we're no longer with whom we're talking to, but now we're critiquing what we've just said. And so when we can shift the focus to being interested and invested in being clear and wanting to make sure that we're connecting, or that the intention of our, if let's say I'm communicating with my daughter about why we don't just run across the road without looking both ways, I will really stop and make sure I'm clear about that. I'm not thinking about, am I coming across as mean? Am I worried that she's not?
Got to make
a
point.
You're just really genuinely trying to connect. And I think people forget that communication is more about connecting than being perfect, right? Yep. And so being able to return to that, sort of mindset of I want to clearly connect with this individual and not worrying so much or getting into the chatter in your head that might distract you from being present.
Sure. Love it. I think it's funny. So if you're listening to this, I know my kids and my wife are thinking, Preston, don't go try to do something in the nude, right, on stage. But I've done something like that. I did a comedy class, so listen to that.
Very close. They're practically the same thing.
Practically the same thing, standing in front of stage, hoping people laugh at your stuff, and that was a way for me to kind of expand my comfort zone a little bit, and that was a fearful thing, but a great. So everybody can have different ways to do it, but thank you. I think that was very vulnerable for you to share that on it. I want to ask you a little bit about your voice in influencing other people, right? So some of this might come down to the how versus the what, but if you want to influence somebody, meaning that you want to persuade them that you're about the way you're thinking about something or to do something or whatnot, how do you use your voice in influencing somebody? Now, I want to pause for a minute. Here's where this might come in. I know you're thinking, okay, where's he going with this? And let's riff a little bit. I love that word, right? So one thing that was important to me is that you asked us to bring a script in. And said, I thought to myself, this is easy. I'm going to bring in one of my childhood heroes I like, and I'm not going to talk politics here today. That's not the point on this at all. But I brought in it was a manuscript or a piece, right? On do you remember this? Maybe it was Ronald Reagan.
Yep.
And so I thought, this would be awesome. I've always wanted to do this. It's like just one page. You have a large type on it. And the idea was that we would come in and read it, and we would read it the way we thought it should be read, I guess, or the way we want to read it. And I had all the markups. I handed you the page and all that kind of stuff. And the first time I read it with an extremely authoritative voice. Like Ronald Reagan was telling Gorbachev, take down this damn wall, right?
Yeah.
Or you're going to be in trouble. And then the second time, I think you guys listened to it again. Then finally you just stopped me and you said, Preston, how does Ronald Reagan sound normally? And the word I came up with was friendly. Even though he was at the Berlin Wall challenging Gorbachev at the time, the premier or the president of the Soviet Union, to take down the wall and let their people be free, he still had a commanding but a friendly tone to him. That's what it came across. And so the reason I bring that up is because it impressed upon me that if I'm trying to influence somebody, I don't have to. That's part of the tone thing, right?
Yeah.
I don't have to forcefully tell, but I can still say something in a friendly voice in the way. And so what would you say to that?
Well, I think the thing that comes across sometimes when people are trying to persuade is that, again, it's self-interested. Like they're interested in themselves, I guess is what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. I need to persuade Preston to ...
That's so right.
Versus I want to relate to him and convey my need for, our communities to come together. And for us to find peace, and whatever the thing is, it's no longer about me and my need to either control or, manipulate or persuade, but it's rather I would like to communicate an idea upon you that's not necessarily about me. It's like a mutually beneficial thing. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, comes across in our tone and our pace and how we're delivering things. So I always like to take these sort of one sentences, and I'm going to try to see if I have one here that I can pull up. But for example, she never told him I was late. Okay, like a simple sentence like that. Mm. She never told him I was late. She never told him I was late, or she never told him I was late. Right? You have all these different ways of highlighting different words that then all of a sudden change the way something comes across. Right? And when someone is trying to persuade somebody or get them to see eye to eye, I think before persuading, you have to connect.
So agree.
Right? So that's why when I come into a room, instead of me thinking, I need to impress people, I sort of enter into, I get curious, right? So when I came into this room, I start asking questions. Yeah, right. And when you ask questions, then you can connect to people because you can find common ground. And then eventually you can get to the point of the discussion that you need to. But first you have to be connected. You have to care, right? And this actually goes even back. I'm going to take your listeners to the world of theater because sometimes people will have a scene where two characters are arguing on stage and it's mean madness, right? And anger. But my teachers always taught me you have to find the love. There has to be love to have conflict because if you didn't love, you wouldn't care so much, right? Yeah. And so I always think about that even when you're caring so much, it's because there's a reason you care so much. Something is so important to you. And if you can find what the person or your audience cares about, then you can connect to them
So
about what they care about, right?
So good.
I don't know if I answered your question.
You did, and so I do workshops on connection too, so it makes a big difference. But one of the practices I have is when I'm either doing a keynote speech or before I do training, and for like an hour and a half workshop or something, I will invest time about going and working the audience before.
Yes.
So I'll go out, meet people, and ask them questions about where they're from, what do they do, what's your favorite thing, why are you here, those kinds of questions. And it's interesting. It's a few things have happened. That's a differentiator because I've been invited back or to other places just because I did that one thing.
Of course.
But the other thing, it helps me on stage, either if I'm on stage or if I'm down below working a workshop. I can, once I start my content, I can make that eye contact, and then they smile back at me, or I'll mention somebody's name in the first name in the audience, or make that connection. To your point. So it's not just dry, somebody coming up and saying, hey, here's my content material, I'm going to walk you through it.
Yeah.
This is more personal for you and trying to connect with the audience. And that makes a world of difference.
Of course. I think, and also one of the things I once read was one of the top 5 words that people love the most are their names.
Oh, yeah.
And so I always go out of my way similarly to ask people their name and then to try, as you do, in presentations or workshops to connect and say, oh, like Preston said earlier, so that you can make it relative to them. Nobody wants to be talked to.
No.
Right?
No.
Nobody wants to feel like you're up there with a dry speech.
Yeah, that's right.
They want to feel like you're equally invested.
Right.
Yeah.
Makes a big difference. There's Dale Carnegie. I don't know if you've ever heard Dale Carnegie. He wrote a book called How to Win Friends and Influence People. Wrote it in the 30s, right? Classic. Yep. But one of his principles is the sweetest sound in anyone's or any language is somebody's own name.
Yeah.
And so his point is that it's so important to remember those names, make the connection, pronounce it correctly. I even asked you, remember I asked you how you pronounce your last name before you came in because I want to make sure it was Rysdon, that I said it correctly.
Yep.
Right? People say my last name, Poore, instead of Poore.
Oh,
right?
interesting.
Kinda,
yes.
Anyway, we'll throw all that out the window. Good stuff. So we're going to move into the next block real quick here as we wrap up. Morgan, on this, you've been a complete joy to have on today. 3 questions that people sent in. I did no, they didn't actually. I just made these up. But I tell people that. We're good with that. But there's 3 questions, so I want to ask you real quick. And these are meant to be shorter answers, so we won't have much of a dialogue. And if I go a little long on my side of the answer, just let me know. Raise your hand or something and say, press. Let's just cut it off.
Okay.
I'm just kidding. So from your experience, what's the biggest mistake when people try to communicate effectively? I think you alluded a little bit to that about connection. I don't want to put words in there, but what do you think that might be that when they
I think people try too hard.
Do you?
Yeah, I think people force things out. I think people go quickly because they don't want to bore people and they're trying to get everything out in a short amount of time instead of thinking about how am I sounding? It's the what. Well, I want to get everything out in one. No, you could leave people curious and let them ask more, right? And I do think, I always draw I like to have real life examples. So if you think about people like the Tony Robbins out there versus the Oprah Winfrey, who would you prefer to listen to read a story to you?
I don't know.
Okay. Well, go listen to Tony Robbins. His voice has a little bit more, it's gravelly. Okay. He has what we call vocal fry because he speaks in these large audiences where he's motivating and inspiring. And so as a result, his vocal cords have been damaged. Yeah. Versus Oprah, who's always mic'd. She'll speak softly. The audio tech guys will take care of making sure that she's heard. And I think that, I'm not saying Tony Robbins is not an amazing, powerful, motivational person. I'm just saying that I think people will try to get a point across at their expense, and it makes it hard to listen to them. You don't really, we may not know it consciously, but sometimes we'll tune people out because we feel like we're being yelled at or we feel like we're being talked at so fast we can't keep up. And so I think for people to recognize communication's 2 ways. It's not just me speaking, it's you understanding and hearing and listening to what I'm saying. Yeah. So being aware of how people are receiving. And then in that case, you can also see when people have questions. You can anticipate if people are confused, and then you can add on and say, to clarify, ... So being able to kind of read the room as you're communicating,
Yeah, sure.
I think is helpful.
Give me 3 real quick. This is not on the thing, but you mentioned something about you teach people how to be present in the moment. I think you're doing a great job of that today, by the way. You're practicing it well. But if you were sitting across from me and gave me 3 things, not to give away, I know you do a lot of coaching around it, so I don't want to divulge too much.
Whatever.
Okay. Or give me all the skinny. Give me the skinny.
Of
Tell me,
course.
how could somebody learn to be more present in their wherever they are?
I think the first thing is think about something that you're touching.
Okay.
So you're touching maybe a computer, maybe you're touching a table, maybe your hand is on a glass, and then feel the temperature of the water or the tea that you have. And then what does that feel like? So then you're in the actual present moment. Maybe you can hear the hum of a machine next to you, the hum of a fan or an AC or a heater. That brings you to the present moment. And then also, what am I looking at? What am I seeing? And where am I in space? And you can extend that to all of your senses. We in Alexander Technique talk a lot about proprioception, which is a fancy word of saying, where are you in space? Where is your body? So you earlier had talked about the fact that you kept moving your head like your mentor. And so, but maybe you weren't aware of that till you saw a recording and then you said, wait a minute, why am I doing that? You know? But if you were aware and present, you would know I'm tilting my head to the side. I don't really need to be doing that, especially since I woke up with a crick in my neck, you know? Right. So being able to sense with your sight, smell, sound, you know, all the senses, plus this added idea of where am I in space can be really helpful to stay present in the moment.
So good, so good. All right, great. Let's go to the next question. For leaders who feel like they're figuring out how to express themselves authentically, what's one key piece of advice that you'd give them? Authenticity. I know we touched a little bit on this today, but what would be one key piece of advice you'd give them?
I think becoming aware. If you don't know what you do, you can't really change things that aren't working. And I think I talked about this in our class together. I'm a huge proponent of changing ideas of judgment into observation. So being very clear about what you are observing and being aware of, and turning those into very constructive observations versus judgmental speech. And I'll give you an example. Let's say that you do a keynote speech someplace and you have a recording of that and you watch it. And you say to yourself, oh my gosh, that was horrible. That's not very helpful. That's not constructive. What was horrible about it? Why didn't you like it? Right. I was using my hands a lot. I didn't move around the stage. I didn't make eye contact. I read too much from the screen. Great. Those are observations that we can work with. We're not saying I'm horrible because I didn't make eye contact. Good. We're saying I observed I didn't. And then I would choose 1 or 2 things to try to change. So when you have awareness, you can then start to pick and choose. Today I'm going to work on breathing. Yeah. I'm just going to exhale. Or today I'm going to work on making sure that I am using the entirety of the stage from right to left. I'm going to go up and down on the stage and use levels. Maybe I'll sit and stand. And just making sure that you are choosing to work on something, and it doesn't have to be perfect. Yeah. I always say 1% better. If you moved once across the stage compared to the last time when you didn't move at all, you've already improved. Yeah, right. You know what I mean? So really just trying to become more aware so that you can decide what are the things I want to work on, and you could even list them and say, I'll first, you said what's the key piece, but it's like you'd have to break things down because change does not happen overnight. When you see somebody who's amazing, do not be fooled that they have not put in a lot of hours in practice. That's right. And hopefully, you keep in mind that everybody starts from someplace, and that you will only get better at whatever you practice. Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting, this awareness idea. One thing that I've found very helpful in either my executive coaching that I do or some of the workshops is I'll give people a survey early on and have them self-evaluate themselves on things. And then it helps heighten an area that they may need to improve or whatnot versus just sitting and listening to me. Yeah. They have a chance to sit and think about themselves for a moment and say, okay, how's this going to apply to me? Yeah. And the fun thing is that even after coaching, you have them do that survey early and then after. And you can talk about this idea of, hey, we weren't headed for perfection, but you were headed and see the progress that you made over time. And then what else do you want to work on? So good. Last question for you on strengthening your voice. It says, for listeners who want to start improving their confidence and vocal presence today, what's one practical exercise that they can try this week? What's one thing, Morgan, that we could do? You know know this one. What
Tell
is
me.
the one exercise that I said I want everybody to do every single day for at least 10 to 15 minutes a day?
And I didn't do it, but I know what it is. It was laying on my back and doing the breathing exercise.
Yes, it's
right?
called constructive rest.
Yes. Very
And
good.
we can be sure to link to stuff so your listeners can have all of the information.
Yeah.
But you basically want to be in a quiet space in your home or in your office where you have a yoga mat or you're lying on a rug and you've got a couple books under your head to support yourself, and then your knees are bent, okay? When you're in this position, you're not listening to the podcast, you're not listening to music, you're hopefully not engaged in conversation with others in your home, but you're just tuning into what does my body feel, what am I noticing, and then you're practicing exhaling. So the exhale, we call it a whispered ah exercise, which means you're just breathing out on an ah sound, but with breath. And you just don't have to worry about the length of the breath or how much you have. You're just getting used to letting air out. We tend to be a society of overbreathers. We take in air. People say breathe, and it's an action. It's I'm going to inhale. And when Alexander teachers talk about breathing, we actually focus on a release of air so that then you can bring the breath back in. So you could practice that idea even with speaking, where you have a sentence, I would like to have avocado toast for breakfast. And you say a sentence, and then you continue letting air out. And you might find at the beginning that you have less air to let out, but as you continue practicing, you feel like, oh, I have more air. If your body is relaxed, your breath and your voice will be relaxed.
Yeah.
So the more that you can find ease in yourself physically, the more that's going to come out also in your voice and in your breathing when you're talking to other people.
So good. So I practiced that, but I wasn't laying down, and I have to tell you how I used it. I still think about it, so I do it on occasion, but I don't take the time like you're saying I should.
That's all right.
You need more. I need more coaching from you. But I did find myself when I was in Detroit. Gosh, it was late last year, and was in there, had a dinner, and then the next morning I get up and I have a talk at 7 a.m., a half-hour thing. But I found myself in the shower remembering this breathing thing and just at least doing what you just mentioned about that.
Yes.
To help from a voice perspective. And I found it relaxing. It was good. So it
Yeah.
helped me a whole bunch.
And
so.
you can do it. I think sometimes people think, I mean, this goes back to you don't have to necessarily lay on the floor to practice this idea of breathing.
Right.
It's just ideal if your body is relaxed. Yeah. But let's say you're in an elevator, you're running late, and you've got to go up to the 12th floor and nobody's in there with you. Exhale. Chances are you're holding your breath because you were running late,
That's
you
right.
hit traffic. So now you're in the elevator. Enjoy it. Enjoy the 12 flights that you have to go and exhale. Relax your body, relax your facial muscles, soften your shoulders, let your neck relax, make sure your knees are not locked. Go through sort of a body scan, even in these everyday, moments that you might not otherwise check in. You can check in and start to practice the same kind of idea and concept.
Love it. Exhale. I love it. Very good. Well, Morgan, thank you for being here today.
My pleasure.
What up, man? No, it was my pleasure. Appreciate you coming on and continue to learn a lot of things from you. And thanks for joining us today on P Cubed. I hope you enjoyed this episode with Morgan as we talked about not only just the voice, about finding our voice, but actually using our voice. And if you want to learn more about her or Alexander Technique, we'll make sure we put links in the show notes and you can find stuff there if you will. Hey, and if you like this episode, please make sure that you subscribe to YouTube, Apple Podcast, or iTunes, and make sure you follow me on social media. That's Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. Thanks for being here today. This is Preston Poore, P Cubed. Take care and talk soon.